It all started with a phone call that would shake the foundations of a family that the world thought it knew. Imagine this: a man, in his early 80s, sitting alone in a quiet room, his phone buzzing insistently, the kind of buzzing that carries more dread than excitement. On the other end is a daughter, the same daughter whose every move has been scrutinized by millions, whose life has been broadcast and dissected in tabloids, documentaries, and social media feeds. The very same daughter who built a life that seemed polished, controlled, and untouchable. And yet, here he was, Thomas Markle, receiving a call that would not just disturb his sleep, but would shake the very core of his existence. He had spent years in relative silence, letting the media narrate the story of his daughter. But this time, he decided to speak, to defend himself, and, in the process, to expose secrets that many believed would never see the light of day. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, stop for a moment and ask yourself, what would you do if your own child, the one you raised, appeared to orchestrate a scenario that publicly humiliated you? Could you stay silent? Or would you finally step out of the shadows, even if the consequences were unpredictable, even if the world had already taken sides? Thomas Markle faced this exact moral and emotional dilemma, and what he did next is a story that has left both the royal family watchers and casual observers in shock. The world has always seen Meghan Markle as polished, composed, and strategically savvy. She is, after all, the Duchess of Sussex, a title that carries with it not only prestige but enormous scrutiny. But behind the carefully curated public appearances, the poised speeches, and the social media perfect photos, there exists a private narrative that the cameras never catch. A narrative filled with tension, unspoken resentments, and, some would argue, manipulation. The revelations Thomas would soon make threatened to tear through that narrative, exposing a side of Meghan that her public image never revealed. Thomas's decision to finally break his silence was not just a simple statement. It was the culmination of years of being cast in a certain light by the media, years of enduring the subtle, yet piercing criticisms that came with being Meghan Markle's father. For decades, he had been an unwilling participant in the royal drama that his daughter had been thrust into. And yet, despite the distance, despite the physical separation, he remained a key figure in the unfolding saga. A figure whose voice had been missing, whose story had been suppressed, and whose truth was about to shock the world. Let's rewind for a moment and consider the stakes. Meghan Markle, born in 1976, entered a world that was complex, demanding, and, at times, unforgiving. Her early years were shaped by ambition, by social observation, and by the unique pressures of navigating a family that had its own challenges. These formative experiences, according to those close to the family, helped craft the person the world would later see. A woman both fiercely independent and exceptionally media-savvy. A woman capable of turning public perception into a carefully orchestrated stage. But could these traits have also contributed to actions that some would label as cunning or even ruthless? Thomas Markle seemed to suggest as much. When Thomas finally chose to speak, he didn't just release a statement. He gave interviews, spoke to reporters, and allowed his side of the story to surface after years of silence. And what he revealed was more than just defense. It was a portrayal of a relationship strained by secrecy, power dynamics, and what he described as deliberate actions intended to manipulate him. He painted a picture of a daughter who, in his words, had set him up, creating situations that left him vulnerable to public criticism while protecting her own image. For the public, this was astonishing. For those who had followed Meghan's rise to global prominence, it was almost unthinkable. Could someone so revered and admired in the public eye really engage in such calculated behavior against their own father? The tension here is palpable. Consider the emotional weight of being publicly misrepresented, of having every choice scrutinized and often distorted, all while trying to maintain dignity and family loyalty. Thomas's decision to speak was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the narrative surrounding Meghan Markle. He challenged the carefully constructed public persona, revealing cracks in the armor that had seemed impermeable for years. His words, while restrained in some ways, carried a heavy emotional charge, hinting at betrayal, frustration, and disappointment. And yet, they were also undeniably human, revealing the vulnerability of a father who felt both powerless and compelled to act. Now, let's turn to the emotional core of this story. The public often forgets that behind every headline is a family, and behind every controversy, real human emotions. Thomas Markle's decision to speak out forced us to confront the uncomfortable reality that fame, wealth, and royalty do not inoculate against familial conflict. If anything, they magnify it. The stakes are higher, the scrutiny more intense, and the personal consequences more devastating. And it is precisely this amplification that makes this story so compelling, so impossible to ignore. We are drawn not merely by curiosity, but by the raw human drama, the betrayal, the secrets, and the tension between public image and private truth. But what exactly did Thomas reveal? That is the question that kept audiences glued to every article, every snippet of interview footage, and every social media post. He spoke of a sequence of events that, to the casual observer, might seem subtle, even insignificant. But upon closer examination, these events reveal a pattern, a strategy, some might say, that painted him in an unfavorable light while safeguarding his daughter's public image. These weren't random incidents. According to Thomas, they were carefully constructed scenarios that positioned him in a negative spotlight, making him the subject of public criticism and speculation. And for a man who had lived quietly for decades, the experience was both shocking and painful. It is important here to pause and reflect on the nature of public perception. Meghan Markle has long been portrayed as a figure of influence, elegance, and, in many ways, control. Her rise to global recognition was fueled by charisma, intelligence, and a keen understanding of media dynamics. Yet, the revelations from Thomas Markle forced the public to question a fundamental assumption. Can the person we see on screen, in headlines, and on red carpets truly be separated from the private reality of their actions and relationships? The answer, as Thomas suggests, may not be as straightforward as we once believed. Let's also consider the audience's role in this drama. We, as observers, are not passive witnesses. We engage with the story, debate it, and, in many ways, participate in the narrative by assigning judgment, empathy, or skepticism. Thomas's statements forced the public to grapple with difficult questions. How far does ambition go? Can loyalty be preserved in the face of fame? And, most importantly, can family survive when public perception and private reality collide in such dramatic fashion? These questions resonate because they are universal, even if the scale here is unprecedented. They remind us that behind the glitz and glamour, the scandals and headlines, the story is fundamentally human. The tension escalates further when we consider the implications for Meghan herself. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over years, suddenly faced scrutiny not just from media outlets or critics, but from her own family. The stakes were personal and public simultaneously, a dual pressure that few could navigate with grace. And yet, the public was riveted. Every statement, every interview, every subtle hint of a reaction was analyzed, dissected, and shared. This is the paradox of fame. Visibility offers influence, but also magnifies vulnerability. And in this case, the visibility had turned a private family conflict into a global spectacle. So where does this leave us? Thomas Markle had broken his silence, revealed his side of the story, and hinted at actions he deemed calculated by his daughter. The public, naturally, had questions. Was Thomas's account entirely accurate? Was Meghan aware of the impact on her father, or was it a calculated move to control narrative and perception? How much of this story was mediated by tabloids, social media, and public opinion? And most importantly, what would come next? Because in a story like this, the revelation of one truth often leads to another, and no one is truly safe from scrutiny. And here's the most crucial point to consider. The drama doesn't end with Thomas's statement. It's just the beginning. Because what he revealed opened doors to further questions, deeper conflicts, and unexpected consequences. Every detail teased the possibility of more shocking information yet to surface. Every sentence hinted at emotional and strategic layers that had been hidden from public view. The tension is electric, the stakes are personal and global, and the curiosity gap is insatiable. Viewers are left on the edge of their seats, wondering what comes next, and more importantly, how it will unfold. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a hairline crack in a wall that no one notices until the entire structure begins to shake. The Markle family, long considered a unit defined by love, loyalty, and the ordinary struggles of a small but ambitious family, had been experiencing tensions for years. Most people didn't see it, because the narrative the public received was carefully curated. Meghan, polished and articulate, presenting herself to the world as a determined, kind-hearted actress and eventually a duchess, maintained the image of a close-knit family. But the reality behind closed doors was far more complicated. And it is here, in the early years of Meghan's life, that the first cracks began to form, a foundation that would eventually lead to public confrontations, private betrayals, and a father finally compelled to speak. Thomas Markle, born into a life of modest means, had always taken pride in being a dependable father. He was the man who changed diapers, attended school events, and watched quietly from the sidelines as his children grew and found their own paths. He had high hopes for Meghan, like any parent would, and invested his heart and energy into her upbringing. Yet, early on, it became clear that Meghan had a streak of independence and determination that often conflicted with his own expectations. Not rebellion in the traditional sense, no teenage angst or dramatic confrontations, but a subtle and persistent drive to control her own narrative, her own environment, and eventually, her own destiny. It was a combination of ambition, self-preservation, and an instinct to navigate complex social environments that marked her early years. Observers who knew the family described Thomas as warm but cautious, a man who understood his limitations and tried to support his children in ways he could. Meghan, however, learned early how to maneuver in environments that demanded strategy, diplomacy, and sometimes subtle manipulation. These early behavioral patterns were not malicious. They were survival tactics, honed over years of observing the world and understanding the stakes of public perception. But as Meghan grew older, those tactics began to clash with Thomas's straightforward, open approach to life. Where he was honest and transparent, she was calculating and deliberate. Where he sought connection, she sought control. And over time, these differences planted the first seeds of tension, a slow, imperceptible friction that would later explode in ways no one could have predicted. The public often misses this early context because it's overshadowed by Meghan's adult life in the spotlight. But it's critical to understand how these cracks formed. By the time Meghan reached her 20s, she was already navigating professional ambitions with a keen sense of image management. Her father, meanwhile, struggled to understand how to be part of her life without becoming an obstacle. Small misunderstandings, minor disagreements, and subtle frustrations accumulated over time, forming a hidden tapestry of tension. These moments were rarely shared with the public. They were private, almost invisible to outsiders. But they were deeply felt by the family members involved. Then came the first public signs of strain. It wasn't dramatic at first, just glimpses caught by photographers, small remarks in interviews, and selective portrayals by the media. Thomas Markle began to notice that whenever Meghan achieved a milestone or faced a challenge, he often felt sidelined. Decisions were made without his input. Moments he expected to be included in, family milestones, career celebrations, were either overlooked or mediated through layers of publicists and advisors. To an ordinary father, this might feel like a minor frustration. But for Thomas, it became a source of persistent disappointment. And for Meghan, these omissions were likely tactical, intended to maintain her carefully curated public image while minimizing personal vulnerabilities. By the time Meghan entered the global stage, first as an actress on a popular television series, then as a figure engaged to Prince Harry, the dynamics had shifted entirely. What had been subtle tension escalated into fully realized estrangement. Thomas, now facing global attention because of his daughter's engagement to a member of the British royal family, became a reluctant participant in a story that was larger than life. Every statement he made, every photograph he took, was dissected by tabloids, social media, and news outlets worldwide. And yet, despite this scrutiny, he remained largely silent, allowing Meghan's public persona to dominate the narrative. This silence, however, was not acceptance. It was a simmering frustration, a growing awareness that he had been sidelined not just publicly, but privately as well. Then came the turning point, a series of events that Thomas would later describe as deliberate setups, orchestrated to protect Meghan's image while casting him in a negative light. According to him, there were interactions, phone calls, and staged opportunities that made him vulnerable to public criticism. Some involved miscommunications, others involved media leaks, and a few appeared almost surgical in their timing and impact. The result? A father left feeling betrayed, a daughter maintaining her carefully curated reputation, and a public left to interpret the drama as a simple family disagreement. But Thomas insists, and it cannot be overstated, that these were not ordinary disagreements. They were the product of calculated moves. What makes this chapter so compelling, so riveting, is the emotional complexity. We are not dealing with simple notions of right and wrong. We are dealing with human behavior at the intersection of family, ambition, and public scrutiny. Imagine being a parent whose child is globally admired and whose every move is celebrated. Now imagine realizing that some of those moves are leaving you exposed, vulnerable, and misrepresented. The psychological impact is profound. Thomas Markle's eventual decision to speak out was not made lightly. It was made after decades of feeling powerless, unheard, and publicly scrutinized while privately bearing the weight of personal betrayal.